Hello, I'm John Kaster. Welcome to this Code Rage 10 deep dive into the runtime library. To put together this list, I used a couple of different sources. My primary source was the source code changes between XE8 and 10 Seattle. So I used Beyond Compare for that, and you can see here a comparison of the source folders from XE8 and DXS, or Delphi 10 Seattle. And the data folder, for example, has changed files which are indicated in red and new files which are indicated in blue. If we look here under ADO, that's just red, and there's only changes to ADODB, which I'm actually going to talk about. Under the cloud folder, then there's additional new source files and changes in those source files. And if we look here, you can see you get a glanceable thumbnail of all of the changes that are made to the source code. Beyond Compare is nice in that it shows you comments differently than the actual source code changes. Comments are in blue, actual code is in red, so that makes it very handy for comparing these changes yourself. As you can see, there's a tremendous number of changes in the runtime library source code, so the focus of this talk is not to document every single change, which would be ridiculous. That's what you would just use a Beyond Compare or some other tool for, but to actually talk about the behavioral differences and the performance differences that you will get with the runtime library.
After comparing the source code, I also referred to the What's New document that's on the doc wiki and the release notes, which actually helped me understand what some of the source code changes meant that I was looking at. So that's definitely worth looking at and exploring the links that go from there. The bug fix list was handy to read also. It was nice to correlate the bug fixes to the source code changes that I discovered when I was doing the source code comparison. Another good source of information on the runtime library changes at a higher level is the webinar, the Rad Studio 10 What's New webinar replay. And probably even better than that now is the Rad Studio 10 Seattle Deep Dive recordings that are available at the link you see here. So there's a whole bunch of information available from that all-day seminar, basically. So those are all good sources for you to look at. So there are some themes or types of changes that we see in the runtime library. There's, of course, new features, but something that is really significant in this version is that there has been runtime library performance improvements. There have been bug fixes, some of them pretty esoteric. General code improvements, so the code is more sustainable, better to maintain. Platform enhancements across all platforms, not just Android or iOS, but also Windows. One thing that I found interesting was that source code with if assigned foo, which I always thought was a best practice, was changed to if foo does not equal nil, and I'm sure that's going to cause some discussions in some corners for people who like to pay attention to Delphi best practices. Other general themes that I saw in the source code as I went through it were list iteration was converted to dictionary lookups. The longer the list, the more significant the performance improvement is going to be. The more often you call a list, the more significant the dictionary lookup is going to be in terms of improving performance. Something I learned new was that nested routines can be used for performance improvement in the code because it reduces the compiler magic calls for string referencing and dereferencing. In most cases, the method that you're going to call is going to work without errors, so the string ref and deref are extra work for the CPU if those have to be allocated in the main routine that you call. Moving, for example, the database error format call into a local procedure also moves that string ref and deref into the local procedure, and that results in slightly improved performance. So when you make a whole bunch of calls to very low-level routines where they might have error handling in them, all of those little tweaks can add up, and you can see some significant performance improvements, particularly in stuff that has tight loops. There's a lot more method inlining. There's more use of utility functions that help make code cleaner. Similar copies of things like encoding routines got moved into common runtime library routines, and the code resulted in being cleaned up. I imagine these integer treatments, some of those are pertaining to the changes that were made for addressing out-of-memory errors with for 32-bit apps for large memory model, but also for just better type support, like the integer native int support. I mentioned on the previous slide additional platform support for FireDAC. Free calls were changed to FD free. Free and nil were changed to FD free and nil. So those are customized FireDAC free routines. And in some places in the code, free was changed to dispose of. And definitely worth looking up that reference to dispose of to see why you want to do that for ARC compilers, such as the mobile compilers. So the topics that I'm going to be covering in the subsequent slides focus on behavioral changes and new functionality. So my code comparison is organized by source code folder. So the main folders that I found that had changes in them were data binding, FireMonkey, InterBase Express, Internet, runtime library, and a bunch of folders under there, obviously SOAP, the tethering folder, tools API, VCL itself, and the XML folder. So to start with the data folder changes, for ADO there weren't that many changes. It was primarily a T-custom ADO dataset, so it applies to any descendant. There's a new function that's actually introduced in T dataset called get calc field types, and in ADO dataset it adds support for FT variant as one of the calculated field types that it supports. And the get field data function has a bug fix for variant arrays, so it has better support for variant arrays for ADO. So even if you didn't expect improvements for ADO, there is one there. Under the data cloud folder, there's a lot of small updates and improvements. In my opinion, there's still opportunities to make the code cleaner with more constants and internal methods that would result in less duplicate code. The CloudAPI has gone through a refactoring as well for authentication improvements. There's signed string routine updates. There's new SHA-256 hash support. Cloud HTTP. The HTTP changes in the runtime library are very broad because the native HTTP and SSL support is now used instead of Indy and OpenSSL. So that also applies to the descendant consumers, like what's found in the Amazon API and the Azure API. There's also a new auth callback method for Cloud HTTP, and what used to be IP HTTP, the peer property, is now called client THTTP client. So if you needed to communicate directly with it, you'll be using client rather than peer. Under the Cloud API, there's also deprecations. As I mentioned previously, there's source code that is used in other places and reused. So these routines became duplicate and they've been deprecated. The cloud service issue merge requests changed to masquerading as patch for Android, and cloud HTTP merge was updated for Android also. So those are the HTTP calls for merge that have been modified to be patch under the Android platform. For the Amazon API, there's a new authentication abstraction. The connection property, or the connection component, also supports configuring a default storage endpoint. There's support for additional Amazon regions. There's a new property type for Amazon queues. You can look up the Amazon queue attribute to see what that has. You can create a queue with a specific name. Content size that's returned is now Int64 instead of integer. So for larger content blocks, you don't have a size issue. The Amazon storage service has a bucket region argument that's been added to its methods so that you can specify which region the bucket goes into for storage. Again, it's cleaned up, uses TNet encoding base64 functions. The service version for the various classes that specify the Amazon service to use has been updated to 2012 11.05 from the 2009 version. And some additional changes under buckets. You can support custom region and endpoint. When you create a bucket, the position in the content stream is explicitly positioned at 0. I imagine that might have been done for a bug fix. Buckets also recognize and handle SHA-256 content. Azure API has some similar changes. Authentication is using the TNet encoding rather than embedded encoding. XML escape has been replaced by TNet encoding HTML encode. Azure Table Service version has been updated to the 2014 release rather than 2009. There was a memory leak in query params on the query entities XML function that got fixed. The Azure service sets the content type to application form encoded. So if you had some low-level code that was expecting certain types of behavior, that might affect how your interaction with the Azure Queue service behaves. You can now set least duration for blobs more conveniently. And Copy Blob Internal has a bug fix for the blob location and checks for response code from Azure of 202 instead of 201. So again, that might be a low-level thing that would affect you with your changes, but probably it's just a bug fix that you'll benefit from. List blobs, blob URL is now updated to include the service endpoint and container name as well, so I imagine that was probably a bug fix. Under the DataSnap folder, the client proxy writer for Objective-C on iOS has specific version support for 4.2, 7.1, and 8.1, so those are identified when the client proxy writer is being emits its code. The FireDAC JSON reflect unit now uses systemnet encoding and system zlib with data compression for better throughput. If you want to see how that works, you can look at an FD schema adapter component with a DataSnap application. And the DataSnap custom REST connection has some new events because of the new native SSL support that's been added to HTTP, which are on validate certificate, on authentication, and on select client certificate. It also has new methods, clear session credentials, and a function to retrieve session credentials to a t-array of string. More DataSnap changes. There is the DataSnap HTTP component that's been significantly refactored and cleaned up. It's actually, I think it's a really good pattern to follow for other communication routines that you might need. There's internal interfaces for in that component for the proxy connection info. I have a typo there. That's info, not into. iHeader list, request header list, request and response. And Get Post Stream now takes advantage of read total content, which was a new HTTP method that's available. So that code is a lot cleaner than it was before. For DB Express, the DBX folder, there are actually some improvements there as well. There's a precision fix for load field def. You can see here that it's looking at the scale and getting determining the value differently than it was before for the precision. So if you have a lot of floating point data that you work with, you might want to verify that the behavior is still the same. There is in JSON for the DBX support on the type kind TK record items, the list helper is involved now, and so the type marshaller for marshal value and JSON unmarshal set field array, both of those take advantage of the list helper to make it easier to deal with collections, with typed collections that you might have in your code. For EMS, I recommend seeing Jim Tierney's session on Wednesday. I'm sure he will cover the high-end functionality and changes for it. The desktop console has many new methods and properties. There's been a lot of work done on EMS in this release. Under the EMS Resource API unit has a new JSON text reader property under the T-endpoint request body JSON reader. There's a new T-endpoint request body response body JSON writer. These are new JSON components that I'll cover in a little while. And also endpoint context has a new edge module class, a nested class, and there's endpoint name and new edge module property that's under the endpoint context. And correspondingly, the endpoint request endpoint property has been removed. The endpoint parameter and endpoint input parameters have been removed. Those probably won't affect you if you're using EMS. You will probably be using it at a higher level, and you wouldn't have those. But if you hacked into EMS to try and get some lower level information out of it, those may affect you. There's also some new module interfaces for new functionality that I'm sure Jim's going to talk about, which are the module resource requests, which is basically a get name call and a module resource request service. And then the EMS internal API has module and resource management functions for unregister, query, retrieve, update, delete, get, patch, post, and put. So you can see there's a lot more support for convenient dynamic management of modules in EMS just by seeing what's in that internal API. And then I actually moved this out of order from the notes that I'm going to be providing a link to at the end of this talk, but there's also an EMS folder underneath REST in the runtime library which has the EMS client API. There's support for module management and module resource management. A new tproc parameter has been added to query resource, delete resource, and add resource to support customized handling of the conclusion of those calls. And new EMS meta types for meta module, meta module resource, and found module and found resource. And there's more, so see my notes for more under what's changed in EMS. For FireDAC, I suggest the deep dive stuff that I talked about earlier, that all-day seminar, and also Jim McKeith's session on Thursday. There's the FireDAC ADO import changed, had an internal BCD structure that they changed to DT FMT BCD. There's Git table defs changes that added provider support for PS-Git key fields and improved retrieval of t-index defs. I don't know directly, but it seems like that's going to result in some performance improvements in that functionality. Git key values, the result is now assigned. Evidently the result was never assigned in that function before. And the batch move SQL writer has a new property called create table parts that allows you to specify what the SQL writer should do for for indexes and other parts of the table. There's an enum list, the physical create table parts enum list you can look at for more information. There's a TDF custom connection. There's two private methods that were promoted to protected, which are attach client and detach client. So if you needed to override those, you could, or hack into those, you could. There's a new overload for exec-SQL. And there's just a ton of other changes for FireDAC. I've listed them all in my notes. I'm presuming that there's going to be a lot of these covered in another session, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. For REST, the REST debugger has added, which if you haven't looked at, you definitely should. It's added a scroll box component, and now it supports using the enter key to open a URL. So that's probably just a usability improvement. The OAuth support is cleaned up for REST. There's a new function in the parse storage API for get JSON date format. Oh, another typo there at the end of my slide. The backend storage API 2 is used for custom date format objects, and the backend storage API added the add date option, and the custom date format is now supported in create object, find object, query objects, and update objects. So it will be set into your TJSON options and then be used, and you can use it in those other functions as well. Additional REST changes. There's the REST request parameter list has new add item overloads. There's a new body params class, which is part of the pattern that was what was done for HTTP changes. Custom request has a new nested tbody class and a new property that corresponds to that, which is body. Execute uses the body parameters now. Add body overload just calls tbody params add. It's just a one-liner. Clear body uses fbody clear body, so it's really cleaned up the code a lot. And reset to defaults also calls clear body, so perhaps that was a bug fix that ended up being introduced when that code got refactored as well. Custom REST response has a new property, which is the JSON reader for reading the REST response, and the custom authenticator has removed iAuthenticator, and authenticate is no longer virtual, so it's been promoted, or been the way it gets invoked has changed on the back end, so it doesn't need to be overridden. For the database itself, this was probably my number one appreciated performance improvement change under T fields, was adding a dictionary for looking up a field name. The ANSI lowercase call is used on the field name to make the field name matches case insensitive, so you should be aware of how the case insensitivity is achieved for that dictionary. And that dictionary index is used for add, remove, clear base. Find field has a list iteration that's replaced with a dictionary try get value. So that's probably going to be the most significant one. If I have time, I will show a demo of that. And field by name is one of those performance improvements I was talking about earlier. It has a nested error procedure so that it's, for every time you call field by name, it should run somewhat faster than it did before. TADT field adds an assign override for special handling on an ADT field. And then TDataSet is what surfaced the new getCalc field types function. Bind fields now uses that function, And resync will check active status before it actually does anything to attempt a resync for the data. So that's a performance improvement as well. There's a new definition for field type varmap, which is shown in this screenshot here. I'm not going to talk through all of it, but I'll assume that you'll take a look at this yourself later on. Main reason why this might be significant to you is if you had some other way of persisting or streaming these values. If you were using the ordinal value of them, this may affect some code that you have rather than using the name. The TDBBit converter class procedures, unsafe from variant, has added support for variant arrays, and bug fixes for unsafe into variant and unsafe into interface now assign results. I apologize for all my typos. There was a lot of stuff to type in. tfield get as BCD changes the way that it actually determines the BCD value, calling str to BCD, get as string instead of cur to BCD, get as currency. That's another one of those floating point things you might want to make sure is still behaving correctly for you. This probably should just make it work better for you. Wide string field get as bytes uses wide bytes of instead of bytes of in its calculation. And again, that's enough on the DB stuff. There's additional changes in my notes. For FireMonkey, there's a whole bunch of changes. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, Serena and Darren's sessions are before this one. So hopefully you watch their sessions or you'll watch the replays for them to see the behavioral changes for yourself. The main themes for FireMonkey, there's native Windows controls now, hints everywhere. So the FireMonkey framework supports hints on pretty much every visual component. The style support has been improved, and the mouse and selection support for the controls, especially the native controls, has been improved. Mouse wheel stuff and text selection and max length set and resize selection changed and so on. There's internal changes to custom scroll box, which look like performance changes. T-list box has selection enhancements. T-list view has major refactoring. That's in my notes. The Android date time picker has support for native date picker, native time picker. The FMX object has an enum proc result that it uses now in some of the routines. There's a FireMonkey style lookup property editor, new editors on that, and again I've got notes that you can look at for more information on that. InterBase Express, I think there's a session on InterBase Express as well, so I'll just briefly talk about changes that I saw. Integer type changes, there's new source files, there's refactored code. Probably the main thing I wanted to surface was that the IB field helper change state returns the change state on the field for InterBase subscriptions. So there's for InterBase Express, there's some new functionality that you could use if you wanted to keep track of what's happening with InterBase subscriptions. Under the Internet folder, T-Web browser has a lot of protected and private changes in the code. There's a published property now called Style Elements and a new property called OnShowScriptError that sounds very interesting. That evidently handles JavaScript errors. I definitely want to investigate that one. As I mentioned before, there's a read total content procedure, or I can't remember if it's a procedure or a function right now, but that one is useful for just grabbing all of the content that you're trying to retrieve rather than having to write your own streaming mechanism for it. TI-SAPI request has a custom override for read total content, and get string variable speeds up raw content support. T-dispatch file request qualify file name has been cleaned up. The logic is a lot clearer now. And then under the RTL folder itself, there's an Android subfolder. Looking at that, there's better application startup and shutdown code in there. There's improved error logging for when various low-level errors occur for Android. There's assignment on startup for the system Delphi activity. The Android helper is introduced. Other helper functions have been inlined. Some have been deprecated, moved into Android helper. The I/O utils added the function get external documents dir and get shared documents dir that are used to abstract external and shared documents references at the platform level, which are the things that you should use. A lot of Bluetooth enhancements, and again, see my notes for a lot more on the Android fixes. For iOS, under the RTL folder, the address book support has been added. The UI text field has a bunch of new methods for selection and mouse stuff for touch. The iOS location sensor getter authorized method calls adds a authorization status authorized when in use, and there's more information in my notes that stuff gets a bit lower level. Under the common folder is the support for new background notifications, which I know there's a code rage session on that as well. There's sensors. Sensors can now support stop, start, and tracking the started status, so you don't have to have a sensor running all the time in your app. Function and performance improvements were added for the T character record. There's a lot to look at there. T-care helper is defined overloads for a lot of different things to help you with Unicode and so on. For hashing, T-hash MD5 has new inline, so it should perform better. There's new overloads for get HMAC as bytes. T-hash SHA-1 has new inlines. Same thing with the additional overloads, and it also adds get block size and get hash size. There's also a new T-hash SHA-2, and more information is available in my notes for that. For JSON, it's really modeled on a JSON.NET implementation, which is the most popular implementation of JSON for .NET. It also includes binary JSON processing. This is based on a streaming model rather than a DOM-like model, so there's abstract TJSON reader and TJSON writer classes. JSON text processing uses JSON text reader and text writer, and the BSON processing uses BSON reader and BSON writer. There's fluent method builders for it. There's JSON array builder and JSON object builder classes, and a bunch more. There's a JSON iterator to move quickly through the collection of items in JSON or BSON. I recommend trying JSON Workbench, and if you're not that familiar with JSON, and that's one of the apps that is available with RAD Studio. Another thing that is important is there's better date-time parsing options for JSON, so you can actually add custom date-time support or override the default date-time recognition support. In my opinion, that's the weakest part of JSON, is that there's no standard for date-time formatting, and there should definitely be a date-time type in JSON. See my notes again for more details. The parallel processing library, Danny Wind is going to have a deep dive on that on Thursday, so he'll probably cover a lot of what I would be talking about in the RTL otherwise. But I do have it in my notes in case he doesn't cover it, so you can refer to my notes. My notes are 50 pages, so of mainly just outline, so you should be able to find some detail in there. There's updates to Threadpool, and T-Task has bug fixes and performance improvements. Some of the bug fixes, actually a lot of the bug fixes are in that bug fix URL that I gave at the start of the talk as well. RTL, 2-ish kind of slide. This is all really under RTL, but this one is specifically for RTL. There's high DPI support that's been introduced. You may have already heard that the IDE has that. Well, the components have that as well. Event dispatch has changed. You can see what the differences are in my notes. There's a new share contract, which is a Windows 8 API and above, so you may be interested in taking a look at that. There's classes and helpers for WinRT interfaces and strings. There's a zip file progress event and file attribute support that's specific to Windows and to POSIX. There's a lot of work on beacons. Again, more in my notes. So there's a beacon advertiser that helps to let beacons post that they're aware that they're around. They're advertising their presence, and the beacon manager has been updated as well. Bluetooth also a lot of improvements on Android. There's new classes and other changes there as well. For HTTP underneath RTL, again, it's native HTTP and SSL on Windows, Android, and iOS. There are bug fixes in there. The cookie support is improved, and that's primarily bug fixes, but in general it just works better. The Windows proxy support has changed and is more clear and concise. OS X, there's new wrappers for various API level things for library support for OS X. There's a new Windows function called Get Product Version that you might be interested in. T-rect structure or class has some logic changes for contains and its intersects functions. If you do graphic type stuff or have your own drawing system, you might want to look at that to see what has happened there. And then underneath the WinAPI and updates, of course, there's DPI support at the WinAPI level. A lot new Windows function imports. There's an entire WinRT folder underneath there, so lots of things to look at and absorb. More on the RTL. SOAP performance improvements via dictionary lookups as well. So there were lists in SOAP for various nodes and identifiers and named things that you would try to retrieve with SOAP, and now they're done via dictionary lookup. So you should find SOAP interaction, if you're dealing with large SOAP packets, to be significantly improved. Lots of updates for tethering with the app profile, Bluetooth adapter, core communication, management of tethering, and the TCP protocol code got streamlined. I think that just kind of happened with the HTTP cleanup. It was like, oh, well, here, let's use that same type of pattern here. The Tools API also got updated. There's new interfaces in the Tools API. There's T-Sprig improvements for the IDE itself. Design interface has a new module attribute called floating that I want to find out more about. Again, there's more notes on the new interfaces and stuff. For the VCL itself, there are new components that Serena DuPont spoke about in the deep dive. So that was one of the sessions on the deep dive. Search box, toggle switch, relative panel, split view, and activity indicator. The button draw method has been updated. Checklist box draw item style support has been updated. Change scale is now overridden in a whole bunch of visual components. This is just a sample. There's a bunch more in my notes, and that's mainly for all the DPI awareness. Input method editor has been deprecated. The Win32 call for it. T-control set visible true is now optimized. Some things, repaint and stuff, only happens if true is set now, and adjust size is called if auto size is true. T-Win control has changes. The dialogues are updated for Style Manager, so that's been improved. T-Custom Form is DPI change aware, so all descendants from that are DPI change aware. The sharing contract component is for that new Windows API. The T-Browse for folder properties, there's a whole bunch more folders that you can support in there. There's a lot of new style hook classes. and there's WinX controls for activity indicators on Windows.
All right, let's run a quick, simple demo to show one of the performance improvements that you'll have if you have any database applications that use tdataset find field, the conversion from a dictionary lookup or to dictionary lookup from a list iteration. This code finds an existing field name, looks for a missing field name, and takes the timings for XE8 and Delphi 10 Seattle. The source code is at the link you see here on GitHub. So let's take a look at it in XE8 first. Just a simple way to label it, checking the compiler version, assuming anything below version 30 is XE8. And then this is the main thing that we're doing. We're specifying the number of fields to create in the data set and specifying the number of times to run through the iteration and looking for a random field name out of the list of fields. And our first loop is looking for the good name. The second loop, we're looking for the bad name, just so that we can see what the timing differences are for success and unsuccessful find. The data set that's created is a variety of field types: string, integer, currency, and date time. Shouldn't really matter, but just to be somewhat thorough, I created different field types just so that you could see that it will work with a random data set and get pretty much the same results, no matter what type of data set you're working with. All right, so let's go ahead and run this in XE8. 100 fields, 1,000 times. So you can see we run this a few times to get some average results. And you have the numbers there, 1473. We're around 1400 one time. We're at 1293, which is unusually fast for the tests that I've been running. But anyway, it's roughly 1400, 1500 ticks. Okay, so let's go over to Rad Studio 2010 and run it there. Run. All right, so you can see the dictionary lookup now is 655 to 677. The highest is 686. So we're more than twice as fast just looking for that one field 1,000 times out of that data set, just by virtue of using the dictionary lookup. Now, the reason why the timing for not found is roughly the same is because if we go through find field, actually let me set a breakpoint here on find field, not on the good name but on the bad name, and you'll see where it goes when that fails. So we won't bother with the timing results, but so if we step in here, you can see the first thing it does is called find field, which is the dictionary version, and because result is nil, it didn't find the bad field name. Then it goes into these other things that call standard list. On find item, that calls index of, which just does a scan. So that's the main difference. All right, so again, the source code is at that location. And I wanted to thank you all for attending. The sources of information that I got are, again, listed here. You can get to those directly from the GitHub link at the bottom there, which has my notes, the Word doc, these slides that you're looking at, and the performance test application that we just ran through the demo. And now we're ready for Q&A. Thanks for sticking with me through all those slides. I hope that little bit of a demo was somewhat of a reward.
The resource document itself is going to be a wealth. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but John spent all that time looking through the source code and doing compare to the RTL. It's just that what's new release notes in his document is going to be awesome to look at, and so he's got those links. But it just shows, each release we end up making some updates and improvements. I know FireDAC has had improvements over time.